Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs for the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, at Georgetown University. And we're delighted to welcome you for the launch of an exciting new book by one of our own. In a moment, you'll hear from our featured speaker, Andrew Imbrie, and our moderator, Avril Haines. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted, and if you're joining by computer, don't be alarmed if you can't see yourself, neither can we. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to alert us, and a CSET staff member will try to help you out. Don't use the chat for anything else. We'll come back to it in a bit. And now it's my pleasure to get out of the way so that you can hear from and later converse with our featured speaker, who will be referring largely to his book, but also to conclusions he's reached in the course of research here at CSET. There's a link to purchasing info about the book in the invitation that many of you received, as well as on our website, in case you'd like to have a copy of your own. Our moderator, Avril Haines, will introduce the speaker and later return to the conversation. Avril Haines served as Assistant to the President and Principal Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, and as Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Avril also held a number of senior legal positions in the government, including legal advisor to the National Security Council and assistant legal advisor for treaty affairs. Avril received her bachelor's degree in physics from the University of Chicago and a law degree from Georgetown University's Law Center. Avril, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's wonderful to be here, and I frankly can't imagine a greater honor than being able to participate in the launching of Andrew's book about America's role in the world, and even more so to have a chance to introduce Andrew, who is an absolutely extraordinary human being for all of those who know him. I first met Andrew when he came to work at the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and he was then, much as you see him today, despite this being about 15 years ago. And when you first meet Andrew, you can't help but notice just what a lovely, thoughtful, gentle human being he is. But his general sense of calm, frankly, and his quiet demeanor is really somewhat misleading. It's true that, frankly, when you first meet him, I think you don't realize what an extraordinary intellect Andrew is, and also what a sense of humor he has. He's absolutely remarkable. He's incredibly intelligent, but he's also very kind. And he's someone who, as you read this book, I think you'll see he's passionate about his ideas and about American foreign policy. And the way he feels about the institutions that, frankly, have been carrying on our foreign policy during the course of our history comes through in the care that he takes in thinking about these issues, undoubtedly inspired by his father and others who have mentored him over the years. But he's also an extremely accomplished person and very experienced in these areas. And most importantly, of course, a senior fellow at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology. But he previously worked as a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and as a senior advisor to Secretary John Kerry. And prior to Carnegie, he served as a member of the policy planning staff at the State Department, where he was a speechwriter to Secretary Kerry. And even before that, moving to the State Department, he served as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He teaches foreign policy speechwriting and rhetoric to graduate and undergraduate students at Georgetown University. I imagine several of them are here. And I'm just delighted that we're going to have a chance to talk to him about his new book, which you all have to purchase now. And Andrew, do you want to start us off by just giving us a broad introduction to the work?
That would be great. I'm so grateful that you're here. It's such a special treat to do this with you, and the feeling is very mutual. I mean, I couldn't be more honored to be in discussion with you today, Avril. And as she mentioned, and for all of you watching, I first met her on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee way back when I was an intern there around 2007, 2008. And I remember so clearly two real facts standing out for me. The first was that I was just learning about the world and foreign policy at the time, and Avril's reputation preceded her. She managed an unprecedented number of treaty ratifications through the committee and the Senate at a time when polarization was growing and gridlock was still a tough issue and still is today. And it was a remarkable feat. And amid all of that work and all of that flurry of activity, she took the time with all of the interns, with me especially, and was such a kind mentor always gave us time out of her schedule and made us appreciate the work that she did and the importance of treaties for framing the international order. So I always remember that and have watched her ever since with a lot of admiration. So thank you, Avril. It's a real treat. And I also want to say a very special thank you to Lynn Weil and the entire External Affairs team for putting this event on. I know these take a lot of work and effort, so I really appreciate that. And a very special thank you to Jason Matheny, our center's founding director, who's just done an extraordinary job. In less than 2 years, I think CSET's really emerged as one of the go-to think tanks for technology policy. And I think in part that's because of its careful evidence-based approach to AI and national security. But it's also because I think of a culture of mentorship that Jason has fostered there that's been such a wonderful part of the experience. And I hope all of you at home will just give me a moment to thank a very special mentor of mine who sadly is no longer with us. He passed away recently, just before the book came out, actually. But his influence is on every page. You know, he was with me from beginning to end and really taught me so much that went into this book. Even in his last weeks, he was sending me ideas and giving me homework, helping me see different sides of issues. Len was a dedicated public servant. He was such a good man, and I miss him dearly, and I just want to thank him and his family for everything they did for me. So one of the things that ties together, I think, all the people that I've acknowledged who are part of this event today is that they care about effective US foreign policy. And that's really the theme of my new book, Power on the Precipice. And what I'd like to do is just share a little bit about why I wanted to write the book, why now, and some lessons from history, and then a few ideas about the road ahead. So why now? Why did I decide to write this book? Well, I want to take everybody back to the fall of 2013. I was a speechwriter then with Secretary Kerry, holed up in my office on the 7th floor of the department, and he was getting ready to take a big trip to Asia. And this was part of President Obama's rebalance to the Asia Pacific, a multifaceted effort to enhance our diplomatic presence, our political, our economic presence, institutionally, militarily. And so it was a really important trip, and he was going to be gone for quite some time. So we were preparing his speeches for the trip. And right in the middle of this, a crisis hit. And it wasn't a crisis from overseas, it was a crisis at home. It was a self-inflicted wound. Our government shut down. 800,000 federal workers were furloughed, over 1 million were sent to work without pay. And President Obama, who was in Asia with Secretary Kerry, had to cut his trip short and come back to Washington to try to deal with that mess. And so we were all scrambling as speechwriters, thinking about how to tell America's story to the world. How would we look to other countries at this moment? And so we started scanning the headlines to try to understand how others were perceiving us. And I think these headlines tell a story. So in England, one of the dailies there said that the United States was, quote, recklessly throwing away its future. In South Korea, a major daily said, and I quote, that we should stop holding our citizens and the global economy hostage. And in Germany, one of our key allies, there was a daily that said that America had shaken its reputation. So what I thought was interesting, and what we all thought as speechwriters was interesting, is that these weren't about any one party, and they weren't about a particular poll or a politician. They were about America's credit and credibility in the world. And the costs of the shutdown were grave. You know, we had to send home Nobel laureates who were pushing the curve of discovery. We had to delay negotiations on a trade agreement with our European partners. We had to delay negotiations and security assistance to key allies. And we had to put up a do not welcome sign for students and refugees who were coming to our shores looking to America as the last best hope. So it was a really significant blow to America's credibility. And I saw this on a trip with Secretary Kerry not long thereafter to the Middle East. We were in a key country, key partner for the United States. And Secretary Kerry was in conversations with his counterpart. And he was urging this foreign minister to enact transparent budgets, to promote good governance, to get its fiscal house in order. And I'll never forget, the minister turned and said to Secretary Kerry, you know, with all due respect, you know, you're telling us to get our affairs in order, but your government shut down because the Congress couldn't pass a budget. And that really drove home several really difficult points for me, which is that our polarization at home is undermining our credibility in the world. It makes it really difficult to come up with bipartisan agreements on foreign policy, which makes for wild swings from one administration to the next. It creates incentives for an all or nothing approach to negotiations, and it makes it harder for us to make promises in the world and to keep them. It makes it hard for us to draw bipartisan lessons learned from the major foreign policy successes and failures of our past. And even more, it makes it really difficult to have a serious, sober, and public debate about some foundational questions in American foreign policy today. For example, should America be intervening in faraway lands? Where, when, and how should it employ force? How do we shape global economic arrangements in a way that can support a strong and prosperous and growing middle class, which is the foundation of our power in the world? Which allies are worth dying for, and how do we adapt our alliances to meet new threats that fall below the threshold of military conflict? How do we shape a deteriorating US-China relationship in a way that safeguards our values and interests, but doesn't court disaster or forfeit the opportunity to cooperate on serious global challenges? What role is there for values in our foreign policy at a time when democracy seems to be on the defensive and nationalism and populism are on the rise? And what will we do with the great institutional heritage of the 20th century, the institutions, laws, norms, and agreements that comprise what we call the liberal international order? Should we reform it, reaffirm it, reject it? These are big generation-defining questions. And I think at the end of the Cold War, we were poised for a serious public debate about the first principles of US foreign policy. But for a variety of reasons that perhaps we can get into in the Q&A, I think that debate fell victim to a certain post-Cold War triumphalism, this idea that democracy and a certain brand of capitalism were destined to spread around the globe. Now, I think not everybody held that view, and there were important countercurrents, but it was prevalent enough that I think it induced a certain historical amnesia and a reluctance to grapple with new and difficult realities. And so I wanted to write this book out of a sense of urgency about those challenges and the challenges that we face, but also out of a conviction that we can choose a better path. And that's really the central argument of my book, that America's decline is not inevitable, but the demand for wise US leadership is inescapable. I think some people say that our best days are behind us, that we can't even get our own house in order, let alone compete effectively with a rising China. Other people will say that our system of government, the structure of the global system, the strength of the dollar will ensure that we get through this. My argument is somewhat different. It's that we have to adapt to changing global dynamics and compete more wisely. Nothing is guaranteed. We have big choices ahead that will determine our future power and position. And so that's what I tried to do in this book. What I do is I lay out 6 big choices for America on how we employ military force, on how we balance our national security toolkit, on alliances, on how we reform our global institutions, how we manage rising powers, how we deal with issues like strategic networks of corruption. And with each chapter, I tell the story of a leader who's wrestled with the difficult trade-offs of each of these policy choices. Because I found in government that really you're looking at so many 51-49 decisions, really difficult moments, and I think they're best understood by understanding how leaders have faced them before. And for each chapter, I then look back into history and ask, can we learn something from other countries? Are there lessons that we can take from history that can help inform us in the present? And what I want to do in the remainder of my time is to just share with you one central choice and some lessons from history to help illustrate it. And that choice is butter or guns. And this, I think, touches on a lot of difficult challenges we face right now in light of COVID, about supply chain security, industrial policy, how do we compete with another country like China with whom we are so economically entangled. And butter and guns is sort of a perennial debate for a great power because national resources are limited, but national aspirations can be potentially unlimited. So the challenge of statecraft is how do you reconcile these difficult trade-offs? Guns refers to investments in our national military strength, so modern hardware and software, new platforms, military personnel. And butter refers to investments that support our national economy, economic well-being, and prosperity. So research and development, infrastructure, science, and education. And the important thing is this isn't an either or choice. It's about setting the right balance between them. It's about calibration. And if you get that balance right, it sets up an economy for many years to come to have strong productive capacity, which is at the end, the core of our military power in the long term. If you get the balance wrong, I think it's a recipe for national decline. And my fear today is that this balance is off kilter in America. Now, this is a bit of an abstract debate at times, so I want to try to ground it in two stories from history. One that I think gives us a warning and another that provides a way ahead. So first, the warning. And I think that comes from the imperial Spanish Empire back in the 16th and 17th century. Now, Spain was at the time, one of the largest empires in the world, and it came to power through conquest and unification, through the union of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, through expeditions overseas and the discovery and importation of New World silver. In the 17th century, it began to decline. And in some ways, this is a classic case of imperial overstretch. It was involved in wars against an assortment of enemies on all fronts, and its defense commitments outstripped its available resources. But this question about battlefield losses and decisions, I think shaped and was shaped by Spain's economic, fiscal, and financial decisions. If you go back and look at the record, Spain was politically dysfunctional. It had faced multiple economic recessions, multiple bankruptcies. Instead of preparing for the future, its leaders waged bitter disputes over the balance of trade and over tensions between rural workers and city dwellers. It even had tensions over immigration and religious tolerance. At one point, it expelled some 300,000 formerly Spanish Muslims, which deprived it of skilled labor and sped the loss of revenue. If you add to this explosive mix several nasty bouts of plague, you get a picture that looks eerily similar to the United States today. Now, there are important differences between the United States and Spain back then, obviously, but there are parallels, and those parallels are striking and should give us pause. Now, Spain's decline was many things, but a surprise it was not. Even its contemporaries sounded the alarm. And one of the characters I profile in the book is a man by the name of Martín González de Celerigo. And he was part of a group called the Arbitristas. These were reformers at the time. You could sort of think of them as op-ed columnists in today's papers, only instead of writing op-eds for the general public, they wrote things called memorials for the king. And one of these memorials, Celerigo writes about the dangers of all this importation of new money coming in from abroad, creating speculation and easy money cultures, inflationary pressures. And in one of his memorials, he has a line that really stuck with me. He said, "Those who can will not, and those who will cannot." And it's an epigraph of my book for a reason. Now, Spain's leaders didn't heed Celerigo's warnings, and they continued to decline in the 17th century, only to try to bounce back in the 18th. Now, is that the path that the United States is going to take? I think there are other countries, other paths we can consider when we think about wise recovery strategies for America. One of them comes from the Dutch, from a similar time period in the 16th, 17th centuries. Now, like Spain, Dutch faced an assortment of enemies, but unlike Spain, it invested in science and technology for the long term, which led to breakthroughs in biology, map making, ballistics, and optics. And instead of expelling immigrants, it welcomed immigrants from all across Europe. It nurtured a commercial vibrancy, which meant that even as its power ebbed, it retained its influence. It created, in effect, a soft landing for itself. So the question by my lights is, which path will the United States take? Will it be the path of stagnation and profligacy, or will it be the path of adaptation, innovation, and openness? And I think the lessons of history really help us here. Let me just share one to close out this opening presentation. And that's avoid the trap of short-term measures and play the long game well. Now, in Spain, there was a mentality called the Hidalgo mentality, which was sort of an obsession with nobility. Rank became the measure of all things, and the value of work declined. Now, by contrast, the Dutch nurtured science and technology, shored up their institutions, and invested for the long term. Historians call this practice thinking in time. And for me, it's really one of the intangible elements of a nation's power. How far into the future do its leaders look? Do they consider the long-term implications of their policies? And so the question I ask myself is, well, what does thinking long-term mean for America? And I think it means three big things. The first is that I think we need to reimagine our role in a post-primacy world, in a world where our margin of preeminence is not what it once was. At a time when our margin for error is shrinking and our resource constraints are tightening, we can't simply wish away the trade-offs or spend our opponents into oblivion or try to dominate everywhere at all times in all domains. We need to shift from a strategy of dominance to a strategy of leadership that harnesses our broad network of allies and partners. I found that America does best when it tries to do a few big things well, as opposed to trying to do many things poorly or haphazardly. The second lesson I think about thinking long-term is that we have a good hand to play with a rising China, but we're playing it poorly. Instead of trying to let the competition with China distract us from our purpose, we should be focused on revitalizing the sources of our own strength, our own economic competitiveness and resilience, and that of our allies and partners. Instead of trying to shape the internal trajectory of China, over which we don't have much leverage and I think is unlikely to be successful, we should try to shape the environment into which China rises, and we can do that. We can link arms with our allies and partners and reimagine our alliances in the region. We can support allies as they try to build a less China-centric regional order. We can set the rules of the road for emerging technologies like AI and 5G. And we can rebalance our national toolkit, investing in assertive diplomacy and development finance, because in a more crowded, competitive, and multipolar world, I think these tools are going to be more relevant than ever. The final lesson, I think, is something that we used to do well, but we've forgotten recently, which is recognizing the importance of foreign policy and economic policy, economic statecraft and national security. The two go together and are powerfully linked. And I think if there's one lesson I've taken from the last couple of years, it's that we have to bring these two things together to craft a sustainable foreign policy that enjoys broad public support. Now, a lot of people ask me when I tell them about this book, they say, are you still optimistic at all about the prospects for the country? You've been studying the rise and fall of countries. Where is America headed? And I do have to say, I have an optimism about where we're going, in part because of the stirring in the country right now for racial justice and equality. There are so many people out there trying to help America recognize and enlarge the definition of we the people. There's so many people willing to fight for change. And one of the most eloquent proponents of that change was the late Congressman John Lewis. And he said something that I think is quite profound. He said, democracy is not a state, it's an act. And for me, no other line better sums up what I was trying to do in this book. We have fateful choices ahead in the country, but I'm absolutely hopeful and have a weathered optimism about our prospects for putting in the hard work of citizenship and for making the right choices so that we can chart a better and more promising future for the country. So I'm really excited to talk with Avril and to talk with all of you. Thank you so much for tuning in. And I'm really just so delighted to share this message with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a terrific talk, and I'm sure there'll be a number of questions and comments after your captivating presentation. Avril Haines gets to exercise the moderator's prerogative and kick off the Q&A. Meantime, if anyone would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and it will be read aloud. Those who are phoning in for this meeting will not be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here. Avril, take it away, and I'll jump in to assist with Q&A only as needed.
Thanks so much, Lynn. And Andrew, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think that was a just phenomenal laydown of kind of where you were coming from and how you've been thinking about these issues. I feel like we have to start with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I know you wrote this book before we really got hit in the United States in particular on this issue. And I wonder, has it affected your diagnosis of the challenges, your sort of projection as to our capacity to, rewrite the ship, so to speak, and so on? How do you think about its impact on what you've described?
It's, I think this is one of the hardest questions. And in a way, we're in the fog of crisis right now. So I kind of approach any answer I'm about to give with some humility, understanding that things could really change. But my first instinct is to go back to history and ask what it's done before. And there are a couple instances from history which help us understand how this can affect great power relations and reset relationships. You go back to Athens and Sparta. At the time, Athens confronted a really difficult plague in 430 BC, and it really undermined their military leadership. Pericles fell victim to it, and it ended up really shaping the course of the Peloponnesian War. You think about the Black Death and what happened in the Middle Ages, how it changed the wage structures and labor and affected the Mongol Empire, completely splintering that empire. And it, in some ways, led to this wave of exploration that followed. Or you even think about Venice, a great superpower of its time in the 17th century, also fell victim to a plague. And that really helped reset the power dynamics between Venice and then rising competitors like the British and the Dutch. So I think there's historical precedent for plagues having a very profound effect on world order. The question is, are we going to see those kinds of impacts today? You know, I think there's a couple ways I would approach this. One at the home front, one globally, and then one sort of thinking about our global institutions. I think the crisis itself is not just an epidemiological virus, it's also a social virus, an economic virus. It held up a mirror to American society and in many ways accelerated some troubling trends at home on polarization, on racial inequities, on income inequality, on the divide between rural and urban areas and where we get broadband and where we don't. And so I think it really, for me, underscores the urgency of a new kind of definition of what freedom really means. You know, are we free without healthcare for everybody? Are we free when income inequality is as stark as it really is? And many of these factors in America today are also part of the foundation of our power in the world. And so I think the COVID crisis really underscores the urgency of reform at home. I think also in the world, we're likely to see an acceleration of many pre-existing trends. You know, for me, COVID is sort of the third great crisis of the post-Cold War era. You know, we faced a security crisis on 9/11 that highlighted the diffusion of power to non-state actors. Then we saw a financial and economic crisis in 2008, which in a way highlighted the transition in power from west to east. And then we've seen now today a massive public health crisis, which I think underscores the decay of power. In a way, no one country really reigns supreme. And in many ways, the two biggest superpowers in the world, the United States and China, both perform poorly in their own ways. And so it's a real challenge to the global order in terms of how it's going to reshape globalization. What will it do to mobility and migration? Will it affect the rise of nationalism? I think it's going to certainly put a premium on resilience in our systems. I mean, we've already seen the threats to food security, climate. I think that the crisis threatens to put many people back into extreme poverty. And so for me, resilience at home and solidarity abroad with other democracies is going to be absolutely critical. I think the story is complicated though on that front because democracies have performed poorly in some places, and in other places, you know, we've seen Taiwan, South Korea, Germany have performed well. China, you know, stumbled in the beginning, but its economy is recovering faster. At the same time, the American dollar seems to be still preeminent, and the Federal Reserve still seems to be the lender of last resort. So it's a really complicated picture, although I think the virus is likely to accelerate tensions in US-China relations and absolutely put a premium on statecraft and on wise diplomacy for navigating the currents ahead. I just have a few takeaways from this, which I think number one is that we need to broaden our sense of what national security really means to include things like climate change and pandemics. That means funding the CDC. You know, I think if by one statistic I saw, you know, we spend 180 billion or more on counterterrorism, and we spend 7 to 10 billion on infectious disease, or you know, something on the order of that. I absolutely think terrorism is a priority and it's important, but is it really that many times more important than a pandemic? And we really have to think about how we invest in our national security and the tools that we use to confront these challenges. We need to think about our national strategic stockpile and we need to think about auditing our supply chains. I think one thing, just from being someone who cares about other countries in comparative perspective, is right now we have over 190 natural experiments going on about how countries respond to this. I think we can try to learn from other countries. A few other things I would do, I mean, I would really think about our social compact at home, given what this has shown about our stark inequalities at home, which can affect our power. I think we need to work with our allies to sort of try to put the world back together again. Think about how we're going to distribute vaccines and therapeutics now, but how we're going to prepare for future pandemics as well down the road. So for me, I just say that I think that the virus at the moment is accelerating a lot of pre-existing trends and putting a premium on what we can do to invest in our resilience at home and what democracies can do together in the world to prepare for the future that's already here.
Thank you so much. Andrea, I mean, I think, you know, as you highlight it exacerbating the concerns that you've identified in the book for the United States at home, and also, you know, linked it as a way of thinking about national security more broadly, as you indicated. I guess one of the things that I want to talk about your view of America as declining, but I think one of the questions embedded in that, in effect, is really how should we be thinking about national power? And you even mention, sort of preluding before you, saw COVID-19, right? That this is kind of an example of how the traditional metrics really for what national power is don't get to things like how you handle a pandemic. Because historically, we've focused on really three metrics: a country's GDP, right, their population size, and their investment in their military. And I think, you sort of expand in the book on a different way of thinking about power. I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit. Do you think that we should be including metrics that really get to things like social and political cohesion, to, supporting innovation, to, our nation's capacity to wield influence through alliances and partnerships and so on? How do you think about it now?
I think for me, that was one of the big takeaways from the book, is how do we understand this nebulous and difficult concept of power. I remember reading somewhere someone saying power is sort of like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but it's really hard to actually understand the science behind it. And I still struggle with it after having spent years. And I have to say, I've learned a great deal from my colleagues at CSET about this. I'd share just a few takeaways from the book in terms of how I tried to understand it. The first is, I don't think we think about time enough when we look at power. So we tend to take snapshots of a current moment instead of moving frames. I think it's really important to look at the trends over time and to see which way those trends are changing. And that's really an important variable that I often don't see in analyses of power. The second is, I would say, institutions. Often when we talk about power, we tally up resources, who has more of what. But institutions are the way we convert power into influence. It's the way we take our endowments and try to translate that into political advantage. And you have to ask yourself, how are America's institutions faring today? That's why I talked about polarization, because I think our polarization really does undermine not just our credibility and credit in the world, but our power. Another thing about power I think is important to focus on is that it's situational, it's contextual. There's a scholar, David Baldwin, that talks about you have to think about power in terms of scope and domain to get whom to do what. So we might be a power globally, but maybe our position doesn't look so good when we focus on the South China Sea. How does power look when it works in very specific contexts? And I think that's another important variable. Avril, you mentioned sort of the intangibles of power. I think this is another area of really important focus for people out there who are thinking about what metrics work best. For me, you can sort of play the counting game. And then there's a different kind of game, which is how do you measure things like social and political cohesion, morale, belief in the national project, equality, like what do people think about their social and economic structures, organizational culture? These things are much harder to measure, but I think in a way they have an outsized influence on power. And so what I've tried to do in the book, and what I think a lot of other people are trying to do, is how do you measure that? How do you avoid what's called the streetlight effect, which is you only measure what's easy to measure. Another thing I'd say is, what matters in power is not just what's out there, but how people perceive it. How do people actually perceive America's power and purpose in the world right now? That will have an impact, because power without consent, power without legitimacy of other countries is corrosive and it won't last. So that's a big thing. I think the last point I'd note is, I think we tend to focus on capacity over capability. We tend to focus on volume. Who has more? We need to have more than everybody else does. But really, I think the right question is, what's your capability? What are you trying to do? What are your goals? What are your objectives? And I don't think all countries have the same objectives. And when we're talking about strategic competition, I think it's important to ask, does China have the same objectives as America? I don't think so. And in that difference, in that asymmetry is the basis for competitive strategies, an old concept that the late Andy Marshall talked about. How do you match up your relative strengths against the weaknesses of a competitor? And I think in order to do that, you have to think about power in a different way. So I really look forward to sort of discussions with people about this, because I'm absolutely learning about it. And I just think it's such an interesting and important concept for American foreign policy.
With that as background, can you just talk to us about what you see as the most critical metrics for looking at America's power, in effect, and how you think about this decline as you've described it? I mean, I thought one of the wonderful things about your book is that you don't just state America is in decline, you actually try to prove it through the lens that you've described. And I think it'd just be helpful for people to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, I would say a couple things. The first is, my broad takeaway is our margin for preeminence is not what it once was. I call it the post-dominant world, a sort of a transitional era where our power is more contested, the rules of the road are less fixed, our influence is harder to wield. So my sense is not that we got our way before. It wasn't that our power wasn't contested before. We've always faced challenges, and in some way, I think our reading of the past is colored by the present, and we think that America was once always dominant. That's not true. But I think our margin of preeminence is changing. And my understanding of power sort of points me to, okay, how do we do sophisticated net assessments? I think we tend to focus only on pointing out the flaws of other countries, but we have to think clearly about our own weaknesses as well so that we can shore them up. There's a historian that said that decline is invisible from the inside. And I think that that's true to an extent. It's really easy to get data on other countries to figure out what they're doing, but we have to also look at ourselves and get the right data on ourselves as well if we want to shore up our position. So where I come down on this, and it's sort of a complicated picture, but I tend to look at relative ratios for political, economic, technological, and military capabilities. So you try to do sort of a balance sheet of how those capabilities are changing and trending over time. And then I look at the intangibles. How are America's institutions faring relative to other countries? Should we be looking at things like relative ratios in R&D, in capital investments? How do we look at relative changes over time in GDP and per capita GDP? What about the military picture? How is that changing? America may have absolute strength in military globally, but how is America's military position and that of its allies changing in key regions like the Indo-Pacific? How are we faring when competitors are employing asymmetric strategies and capabilities in advanced simulations? So that's sort of the picture I get. I would say as a summation that I think America is a great power in relative decline, but with fundamental strengths. And I think China is a rising power with fundamental weaknesses. So it's a really complicated picture, but I do think we have a good hand to play. It's just we're not playing it very well. And just last thing I say about this is, why does any of this matter? And I think it matters for a couple of reasons. The first is that in history, when countries start to perceive a relative advantage in decline, that is, they're rising relative to a competitor, then they tend to press their advantage. We saw that with Japan in the 1930s. We saw it with the Soviet Union when they perceived an upward increase in their power. And then we saw a series of crises over Berlin in the late 50s and the early 60s. And we saw it again with Brezhnev when America had the sort of Vietnam tragedy, and then the Soviets pressed their advantage. So you can start to see kind of anticipate behaviors from competitors when there's a shift in relative power like this. The next is, I think, American power matters because it upholds, I think, the global order. The global order is made up of norms, of institutions, of interdependence, but also it's been buttressed by American power and by the bargains that we've struck with other countries. And generally in the international system, my take is that power does sometimes drive ideas. And if countries are successful that hold one regime type, one kind of view about the citizen and the state, you start to see other countries gravitate toward that model. And so I do think the fate of free and open societies is at stake when we're talking about America's power and position in the world and how it can defend those values. And I just say the last thing that I struggle with is I do think we have this unhelpful political dynamic where in lots of campaigns, one side will say, America has fallen into disrepair and is in irreversible decline. And the other will say, usually the incumbent, I've rescued America from its worst days and we're now surging ahead. And it leaves the public sort of in a way, trying to figure out, well, who's right? And I do think we need a much more sophisticated and upgraded strategic planning and assessment process in the US government and in Congress, because I think the public needs to be involved in this debate. And I do think an audit of national power, investing in strategic foresight so that we can sort of see the inevitable, is really going to be helpful and would help shape a public debate in a way that might promote wise investments in scientific invention and other aspects of our power in the future.
Yeah, part of what I really do enjoy about what you're describing, Andrew, is just that even if, as you see American decline, you also see this trend as reversible and you recognize these sort of fundamental strengths that you refer to. I'm going to combine, frankly, my next two questions, make it my last one, and go to some of the phenomenal questions that are coming in from people in the audience. And I think you write that history shows if leaders believe decline is reversible, they will behave differently and pursue different policies than if they believe decline is inevitable. And I wonder, as you think about that, you've mentioned that in different ways, and I feel as if you've illustrated that point a little bit already. But if you want to talk about that and how seeing decline as reversible actually could lead to better policy outcomes, we'd love to hear that. But the other piece I just want to note is, I think you talk about the fact that bitter partisanship and legislative gridlock is preventing the United States from governing effectively, and that widening income inequality, among other things, is creating new fissures, dampening optimism about the future. And I think your point about sort of racial justice is obviously completely interrelated to the inequality piece of things. And some would argue that if we are to make a convincing case to the American people of the value of revising an international order on the basis of democratic principles and strengthening our multilateral cooperation to promote prosperity, as you indicate, that we actually need to make changes in order to make sure that, frankly, the prosperity gained through that order and through the policies that we would promote actually don't just go to the wealthiest members of society. And do you think we should be looking to promote a foreign policy that helps to address issues such as income inequality? Do you think that's even possible? And is it important to do so to revitalize our leadership in this space?
I couldn't agree more sort of with the thrust of the question in terms of how important this is. Let me try to address the first one, which is about seeing decline in different ways, whether you think it's reversible or inevitable. One of the really interesting historical anecdotes that I came across is about a Chinese admiral named Zheng He. And we all learned as Americans in school that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, but decades before that, this Chinese admiral in China was a great power. They were exploring the world, engaged in these kinds of far-flung trading and exploration adventures, and they built bigger ships than Columbus had, more sophisticated ships. And then a new emperor came to power in 1430 in China, and they started to turn inward and turn away and actually stop the exploration and the trading. By 1500, it was sort of a crime almost to engage in these kind of exploits. And then the Qing dynasty even burned sort of a stretch of its coastline in the south. And this set the stage for a sort of a centuries-long contraction in Chinese power and influence. I think this is an example of seeing decline as inevitable, worried about rising competitors, in their case, the Mongols, thinking about taxation and debt, and turning inward from the world and having it have long-term adverse implications. Now, the mirror image, I think, in some ways is happening today when we think about US-China relations. What does it mean to impose sort of blunt force tariffs, not just on China, but on our allies? What does it mean to sort of see allies in purely a transactional lens and they constantly question commitments? What does it mean when we're thinking about students? Don't we want to welcome the talent of the world while also protecting our research ecosystems? Or do we want to put up a do not welcome sign and forfeit that advantage? I think in America, confident in its purpose, would see these challenges in a different light. It would welcome diversity, would welcome immigration. It would promote trade agreements that support the middle class, but also support American engagement in the world. And it would realize that our allies are a key strategic advantage for America. So to me, I think one from history, one from today, two examples of how decline being seen as inevitable and decline being seen as reversible really could produce different outcomes. And I think that sort of shapes the question about how do we bring foreign and economic policy together. In my sense is that America is good at setting the rules of the road with its allies and partners. And we need to do that for a new generation of challenges and not shirk from it. I think we need to figure out how do we enforce those rules of the road well? How do we make sure the right interests are at the table? So how are labor, environmental interests at the table, not just the biggest corporations? And then how do we do the transition adjustment assistance at home? I think sometimes we've gotten the reverse order on this question. And I've learned a lot about this from Salman Ahmed and Carnegie Endowment, because they've done a great study on foreign policy for the middle class. I think sometimes we get the reverse. We try to negotiate these agreements and then we worry about how people are faring at home. And what we have to do is have those concerns at the forefront of our minds, invest in workforce training and R&D first before we're just going out there and negotiating these big agreements. These kind of have to happen at least in parallel. I'd also say that it's helpful to think through the role of government. I think the role of effective government is so important for America's power and for addressing things like inequality. I don't think government is just about fixing market failures. I think properly combined with our innovation ecosystem, the private sector, universities, philanthropies, government can really stimulate cutting edge research in areas that aren't always addressed by the private sector and on timeframes that are really important for American foreign policy objectives. And I think inequality to me is one of those burning issues. I mean, you look at the statistics, the top 0.1% of the country controlling a quarter of the national wealth, the top 3 people having more money than the bottom 160 million. I mean, this is corrosive of our national cohesion as well as our national power. And I think at the end of the day, we have to ask some hard questions about how capitalism is faring today. We have a sort of neoliberal brand of capitalism today, but we also did it a different way back in the 50s and the 60s. We had a sort of democratic capitalism with checks on capitals, and we had investments in our workforce training and R&D. And I think, we don't want to go back to the past, but I think we can draw lessons from this to inform our policies in the future. And to me, thinking about how we structure our trade agreements, agreements on climate in a way that supports our resilience at home and a more equal and fairer society is absolutely a matter for domestic policy, but it's also so important for our national security and our foreign policy.
Thank you. That was terrific. So we have a lot of phenomenal questions, and I'm going to try to get to as many as I can in these last few minutes. One of them really just gets to this question of, given all of the emphasis that you put on diplomacy, which it seems like folks agree with in many respects, the question is, are we, in saying that we overemphasize the military tool, are we actually, are you suggesting that we pull back on military investments in this context? How do you think about how important our military and our conventional defense tools are?
To me, I think these tools have to work synchronously. So I think for a long time, we've overinvested in the military and in a way, shortchanged our security. Now, military spending and our military posture is absolutely critical. And I think the right question to ask is, what do we want our military to do? What are our objectives in the world? And I think we have to invest in a different set of modernized capabilities to meet the challenges of a new era, whether that's operational concepts for unmanned undersea vehicles, long-range air power, secure communications, cybersecurity and defense. There are a whole range of things that we need to invest in. My argument is that we need to have a broader understanding of national security and to have creative and overlapping investments in our diplomacy and development, recognizing that these support our hard power, that these are critical components of it. And I think that's the challenge, is that I think sometimes we shortchange it, partly because of our history and our culture, partly because it's just easy, partly because of the congressional process. Congressional oversight is so important. But every year it's really tough to pass it's an authorization bill for the State Department. And that makes it difficult to set long-term priorities. And so by my lights, what I would do is sort of try to recognize that diplomacy and development go hand in hand with defense, and to recognize that in a world where it's more crowded, it's more competitive, where our competitors are challenging us below the threshold of military conflict on information, on economics, on maritime security, that diplomacy actually should be our tool of first resort. It's the most credible tool to address these challenges that fall below the military threshold, but that you still need a foundation of strong defense for it. It's just that you need to think about how to wield the diplomatic instrument more effectively. And I would just say, for me, one of the challenges with diplomacy is that we have a set of metrics that create a higher bar for what counts as diplomatic success versus what counts for military success. And the challenge, and I saw this at the State Department, is that so much of our diplomatic work and the sort of noble work of our public administration and our public servants, our foreign policy officials, is that it's invisible. A lot of it happens behind the scenes, on the phone, in conferences. Some of it seems routine and boring, but it's so essential. But its success rests on counterfactuals. The arms races that didn't break out, the conflicts that didn't happen. And so we have to do a much better job of telling this story to the American people and really talking about diplomacy and development as part of an American journey, an American story, not just around elections when we're trying to build support, but all the time, and in communities that don't just hit the sort of the Excella corridor, but go out into the country and talk about this and find the right validators who can really speak to this issue at a local level, because I think we have a great story to tell. I mean, it was one of the best experiences that I ever had to work at the State Department and see how brave and thoughtful so many of our foreign service officers, civil servants, and local employed staff are. And I think telling that story would really help build a constituency for foreign policy in a way that would help elevate it, and I think ultimately benefit our national security.
That's terrific. Okay, so here's another question that seems particularly relevant at CSET, but can you unpack a little more how changing and evolving new and emergent technology is transforming the distribution and diffusion of global power and the implications for how the US can and should approach geo-economic challenges versus just geostrategic ones, and where the two intersect?
That's a great question. I mean, I try to sort of address this challenge in a couple ways. The first is I don't think technology evolves in a linear fashion. And I think so much of the time we focus on the invention of technologies and what it can do, less often what they can't do. But we don't focus enough on who deploys and develops them, how adoption works. And for me, if you look at history, the critical thing is how are new technologies adopted and who benefits? And that's a really important problem that I think America needs to focus on. My framework for sort of thinking about this is I focus on what are the core capabilities of these new technologies, and I can speak to the one that I know better, AI. What are the enablers of these technologies? And then what are the ecosystems that help support them? So AI as a technology, I share this and I hope this is interesting for the audience, it's sort of comprised of computing power, algorithms, and data. And these are becoming really important resources. These are sort of the core capabilities of AI. So when you're trying to think strategically, you ask yourself, well, how do we make sure that those assets are strong for the future? Then you think about your enablers, your R&D, your commercial investment, your workforce training. And then you think about the ecosystems that help support them more broadly. This gets to that intangible measures of power that we talked about, your immigration system, your education system, your innovation ecosystem, your network of allies and partners. And I think America can do so many things on each of these fronts. I mean, I just note one, and let me give a special shout out to Melissa Flagg, who's on our staff, who's done a lot of great work on R&D. Now, this is an area where America has a great model. It has, fantastic universities, a dynamic private sector. It's got philanthropies that are involved, innovation at the local, state, and city levels, and then, of course, the role for government. I think we can reimagine this innovation ecosystem. I mean, in some ways, we had this before with Vannevar Bush at the end of the Second World War, when we realized radar and penicillin helped win the war and science was important, and we had a real strategy for this. I think we need something similar today for the 21st century. We need to sort of reimagine what our R&D strategy is going to be, what are our comparative advantages, and then we need to link arms with allies, because together with our allies, we comprise about 2/3 of global R&D. That's an incredible opportunity to think about how we can innovate more collaboratively together. And that, I think, gets to this point about how then we gain edge in terms of geostrategic and geoeconomic questions. And so I think this is an exciting opportunity to really play to America's strengths and to think about how we can have wise investments in scientific invention and sort of push the technological frontier. But I think we have to recognize we do it with our allies, especially at a time when, as I say, America's experienced a cut in its power. It needs to work with other countries to really leverage their skills and experience and expertise.
That's terrific. And there are so many wonderful questions. I'm going to do one last one. If you just do a quick answer, Andrew, and then Lynn, you should take it away after this. But this last one I thought was particularly good. Just somebody asking, are there lessons that you learned from your research that suggest how democracies can heal themselves and strengthen their power in the context of, so many looking around the world at our allies and partners to say, are basically discrediting democracies right now. And so, this question is, or are we in an unprecedented situation in which we must innovate new approaches, linking foreign policy goals to addressing income inequality or other things along those lines?
I struggle with this. I would say this, I look back to John Lewis's quote about democracy is not a state, it's an act. I think democracy isn't a birthright. It's something we have to prove with every generation, and we have to show it through our choices. So I remain a sort of weathered optimist about what democracy can accomplish, but I don't think anything's inevitable. And I sort of feel, having looked at history, a bit tempered by human folly as well. And so I don't think there's anything inevitable, and we do have to sort of fight and push for this and recognize that the choices we're making are fateful at this moment. I do think democracies have a fundamental strength in their capacity for reform and corrective action. And certainly America has been in difficult places before. So you think about the 1960s and 70s and all the difficulties that we faced back then. But here's something I think that's sobering. You know, we're more politically divided and polarized back then than we are today. The inequality is higher. You know, we didn't have a peer competitor quite like China back then. And democracy, you know, is on the back foot right now. So it's a really challenging moment. And I think it's going to require visionary leadership and the voices of citizens to really push for change. I think there's a couple, you know, reforms on the table that make sense to me. I mean, I think the first problem in America, and I'd love to talk more with people about this, is I think our political polarization and dysfunction, because it's hard to solve every other problem unless we get that right. And there's some smart reforms on the table about ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, thinking about the primary structure, dealing with gerrymandering and money in politics. I think the reforms are on the table, but we do lack the political will to move forward on them. But to me, this is the first problem, is like, how do we fix our polarization so we can deal with questions of racial justice and equality? And I think it's going to require a combination of grassroots mobilization and institution building. And you need sort of both, coming from the top down and the bottom up. But that's what made America, I think, succeed before, that the corrective action comes from the power of the grassroots, people pushing for change, and then recognizing that change needs to be translated into legislative action, into policy. And that's hard, painstaking, sometimes boring work, sometimes agonizing work. But no work to me is more important, and no time's more urgent than right now. So I think critical question. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, on behalf of CSET, I'd like to thank our colleague and featured speaker, Andrew Imbrie, along with Avril Haines, for taking part in today's event. And many thanks to all of you for participating. Once again, there's a link to info on how to purchase the book in the invitation that many of you received, as well as on our website, in case you'd like to have a copy of your own. I've got mine already, and I can guarantee it's a great read. We'll follow up soon with news of our next event. And in the meantime, have a good day, everyone, and stay safe. We hope to see you again real soon, if only virtually. Thank you.